Good morning, everyone. Welcome to our first day seminar. Allow me to introduce you to today's speaker. Burt Hopkins is a well-known phenomenological philosopher. Currently, he is a professor at the University of Lille and visiting professor at Charles University, where he holds a course on Plato's philosophy. He's the author of many works, most notably Intentionality in Husserl and Heidegger, and the other one, which is more related to the topic of today's lecture, is the origin of the logic of symbolic mathematics. Correct?
Correct.
Okay. So finally, I would mention that the topic of today's lecture is related with the seminary held by Petr Kurka. With seminar we had at this department at CTS. So thank you, Bart, and go on.
Okay. Thank you, Jan, for that introduction. Thank you all for the invitation. Riding the tram and bus in the magical city of Prague this morning, I realized I've been studying Husserl for 50 years. And I tried to convince myself that perhaps it's a sign of a misspent life. So this paper is either a monument to the slowness of my learning. I mean, 50 years, come on. Or perhaps a testament to something else. In any event, I'll read the paper, but I'll read it slowly, not the whole paper. So the problem of the unity of a manifold in the development of Husserl's philosophy. Husserl's most systematic phenomenological work, Ideas for Pure Phenomenology and Phenomenological Philosophy, first book, General Introduction to Pure Phenomenology, differentiates pure transcendental phenomenology as an eidetic science from the eidetic science of mathematics. In line with the tradition of transcendental philosophy, arguably ante rem, stretching back to Plato, Husserl contrasts transcendental phenomenology with mathematics and argues that its conceptuality cannot be appropriately articulated and conceived in analogy with mathematics. While both mathematics and transcendental phenomenology are eidetic sciences, phenomenology, quote, belongs to a basic class of eidetic sciences that is totally different from that to which mathematical sciences belong, end quote. The key difference between these two sciences, on Husserl's view, concerns the nature of the essences that are the subject matter of each discipline. Mathematics deals with exact essences, which he characterizes as ideas in the Kantian sense. Phenomenology deals with inexact essences, which Husserl characterizes as morphological. Significantly, Husserl formulates the precise issue of the difference between the two kinds of essences at issue here in terms of the answer to the question, quote, is the stream of consciousness a genuine mathematical manifold? His answer is no. The discussion to follow will focus on Husserl's distinction between a mathematical and a phenomenological manifold in light of the development of his thought, together with an invariant problematic running through most of it, which is behind that distinction. For the purposes of this discussion, Husserl's development will be divided into three phases. One, the early descriptive psychological account of mathematical manifolds. Two, the pure transcendental phenomenological account of mathematical and phenomenological manifolds. And 3, the transcendental phenomenological count of the historicity of the different meanings determinative of both kinds of manifolds. Can
I ask, what is the manifold? Or in Czech, from the translation?
Mannigfaltigkeit.
Can I explain?
Certainly.
This is translation of German Manifold.
Yeah.
And now in contemporary mathematics, manifold and manifoldicity has very specific meaning in Riemannian geometry. But what Husserl meant by this, I would rather translate as a mathematical structure. That means, for example, topological space or algebraic structure. For example, group is an algebraic structure. So this is in formal and transcendent phenomenology in this where this concept is treated. So the right translation in current language would be mathematical structure.
Thank you, Pierre. And actually, I have a footnote explaining the term manifold, Mannigfaltigkeit, as employed by Husserl, has a range of meanings, all of which are related to the basic phenomenon of, on the one hand, a multitude, menge, of items, and on the other hand, their unity, Einheit. Multiplicity, Vielheit, collection, Kollektivum, totality, Inbegriff, are closely related terms and generally used by Husserl with the same intended meaning, which is again, the presentation of a phenomenon that is essentially characterized by more than one item that is nevertheless somehow unified as a whole or a totality. The technical formalized mathematical meaning of manifold, which Peter was just talking about, discussed below, of course, also figures in Husserl's use of the term, and clearly what is meant in this quote. Are you
still think your interpretations are in a quote? That because in what Burt says, I don't see any structure at all. Is there a structure on the function?
Well, there's a unity.
That is
and it's a unity that's not reducible to qualities or the individual members of the collection or multitude.
Yeah, but the set is a unity of members without a structure. So if you interpret it as a set, then it is not a group, but if you do the structure, then you introduce something more than unity of the
and that's what
I imagine a topological structure because it has some points, but also it has like the relationship between the points defines the topology. Okay, yes. Yeah. But then there is the word fold. It's fold somehow, so I imagine topological structure and I'm fine with it.
But what are the units? What are the items in the stream of consciousness?
We're going to get to that, Ivan. We will get to that. I will get to that.
I don't see any items.
Yeah, well, there's phases of time.
They will appear.
No, and actually, Suzanne is right. I mean, Husserl starts out with the notion of a multitude, which is informal, not theoretical. And that's his whole first entree into this in the philosophy of arithmetic, whose project was to actually ground the higher level manifold, the formalized manifold, in the structure of the informal unity of a multitude. And that project totally collapsed. And out of the ashes of that project was born phenomenology. The problem was so immense, Husserl felt the only way he could deal with it would be to found new science. So my discussion will endeavor to show that Husserl's phenomenological account of the formal structure of a mathematical manifold does not adequately distinguish the formality of meanings that are ideal from those that are formalized. Symptomatic of this is Husserl's use of the term formal, which refers to both ideal and formalized meanings in a manner suggesting that they share a common essential structure of formality. That they do not will be shown to be an important implication of Husserl's phenomenological analysis of the constitution of ideal, in the sense of ideas in the Kantian sense, and formalized in the sense of symbolic mathematics meanings. Two phenomenologically significant consequences will be drawn from this. I want to read this note on the distinction between formalization and generalization, because that's absolutely crucial to Husserl's whole approach to this problematic. I'll try to read it because it's a small font. Husserl consistently distinguishes formalized universality from generalized universality, and the processes of formalization and generalization constitute of them. On the one hand, generalized universality manifests the hierarchical structures of meaning, constitutive of the material region of being, from a given region's highest genus down to the infamous species, determinative of the meaning of the manifold of individuals that instantiate the material region. Husserl characterizes the process of generalization that constitutes generalized meanings in terms of the variations that begins with exemplars drawn from factical experience and culminates in the imaginative variation that yields the essence of the various levels of generic universality. On the other hand, Husserl characterizes formalized universality in terms of the non-hierarchical universality of the formal region, any object, whatever, etwas überhaupt, which encompasses, without being reducible to, the generalized universalities constitutive of the meaning structure of material regions of being. Husserl mostly characterizes the process of formalization in terms of the emptying of material meaning from generalized universal meaning structures, a process that is then sharply distinguished from the variation operative in the generalization that yields generalized universality. But he sometimes also characterizes formalization in terms of variation. Well, Husserl is quite clear that the essential forms of meaning that characterize generalized and formalized universality do not have a common genus. In the case of the essential forms of meaning characteristic of the ideas in the Kantian sense and formalized universality, Husserl often speaks as if both shared the essential commonality ideal. That they cannot do so on grounds intrinsic to Husserl's own phenomenological analysis will be shown in section 7 below, which I won't read today. Okay, on the one hand, Husserl's account of a mathematical manifold will be shown to be problematical, insofar as that account has a dimension that is determined by a logical norm, rather than a descriptively constituted eidos. This is, of course, problematical because phenomenology as a descriptive eidetic science cannot legitimately base its cognition without more ado on the appeal to norms, logical or otherwise. In the case at hand, the cognition must rather provide an account of the mathematical manifold that is based in the cognition of its descriptively constituted eidos. On the other hand, Husserl's account of the constitution of the temporal foundation of the manifold that composes the stream of consciousness will be shown to be crucially determined by the appeal to eidetic structures whose formal conceptuality is mathematical rather than phenomenological. That is, Husserl's account of the formal unity and multiplicity constitutive of any given phenomenological manifold does not adhere to the distinction between a mathematical and a phenomenological manifold presented in Ideas 1. Hence, the formal character of the concepts Husserl employs to account for the unity of the phenomenological manifold, that is to say, their formal conceptuality, are mathematical, not phenomenological. This is, of course, therefore inconsistent with the eidetic distinction Husserl himself draws between mathematical and phenomenological manifolds. Once this is established, a detailed account of the phenomenological shortcomings of Husserl's employment of exact mathematical concepts to characterize the constitution of a phenomenological manifold will be provided. Its focus will be on the inability of the mathematical concept of a continuum to account for the phenomenal discontinuity of the past from consciousness of present, both in the case of the manifold streams of consciousness that begin and end, and the foundation of those manifolds in the living present. And by continuum, here's how Husserl characterizes continuum in this context. That is the sense of the phenomenological manifold. The running off continuity of an enduring object is therefore a continuum whose phases are the continua of the running off modes belonging to the different time points of the duration of the object.
So is that the continuum constructed from points, or I didn't grasp the...
Well, we'll get to that because I'm going to in detail address all these things. But yeah, the most basic distinction is the now point. Okay, this continuity will be shown to be manifest in the phenomenon of forgetting, which Husserl's appeal to the law of modification to account for the retentional and protensional flow of consciousness as a continuum is unable to account for. The connection between sedimentation and forgetfulness made by Husserl in a late manuscript will provide the occasion to articulate the horizons of 4 future tasks for phenomenology. 1, investigate the role of the phenomenon of forgetfulness in the constitution of both internal and historical time consciousness. 2, reassess Husserl's account of recollection in making present transcendent objects in the living present in light of the discontinuity of the horizon of the past from that of the present. 3, investigate the role of sedimentation, forgetfulness, and recollection in the constitution of the unity and multiplicity of the manifolds of consciousness that begin and end. And 4, investigate the intentional historical meaning that is sedimented in the origins of the universal formalization that is the sine qua non for a mathematical manifold in contemporary mathematics. For those of you that have the paper, I'm skipping now to page 16. So I'm not going to talk about the Husserl's analysis of both informal unity of multiplicity as well as his account of formalized mathematical manifold. I'm going to get to the heart of the matter today and talk about phenomenological manifolds in Husserl's pure transcendental phenomenology. Husserl's phenomenological account of the manifold of the stream of consciousness has its basis in the reflective thematization of the subjective experience in which the objective identity of the things in the world and the world itself as their horizon appears. Prior to the methodological intervention requisite for the phenomenological description of the stream of consciousness, the objective identity of things in the world horizon appeared directly, without any explicit awareness of the subjective experience that is disclosed by phenomenological reflection to be a condition for the appearing of objectivity as such to consciousness. This phenomenological reflection thematizes the subjective experience in which the object identity in question appears. As thematized, the experience in question itself appears. And it does so as the manifold of perspectives that are conscious of the objective identity of both the things in the world and their worldly horizon. These latter in turn appear as unities that stand out from the multiple perspectives directed to the unity of each that composes the manifold stream of consciousness. The manifold of perspectives thematized by phenomenological reflection pertains to what Husserl terms the eidetic singular, which is in essence's lowest specific difference. What is singular here is precisely the flowing perspectives that compose the manifold as a concretum. That is the essence of that dimension of subjective experience that is absolutely independent of any other essential determination. Descriptive articulation of the essence of the concretum brings to the fore the objective unity of the thing that appears in the flowing perspectival appearances. The latter flowing of experience cannot be, quote, conceptually and terminologically, end quote, secured, according to Husserl. Rather, only, quote, the essential content and the fullness of its concreteness, end quote, can be so secured and thus cognized eidetically. Hence, while there can be, again, quote, no talk of a univocal determination of eidetic singularities, end quote, in this case, of all that belongs to the flowing manifold of consciousness that composes the essence of the subjective stream of experience in which objective identities appear, the content of that essence can be taken as something univocal. Namely, quote, as an ideally identical essence that, like any essence, could be instantiated, not only hic et nunc, but in countless exemplars, end quote. In the case at hand, it can be instantiated in any arbitrarily given, reflectively thematized subjective experience, in which the unity of objective identity appears. Presumably, the essence at issue in the phrase, like any essence, here refers to the non-exact descriptive essences that are the concern of the eidetic science of phenomenology. Thus, for instance, the account of the manifold perspectives of the subjective experience in which the unity of the identical object appears through its flowing is descriptive, since flowing does not appear as the specification of an essence with the characteristic of an idea in the Kantian sense. The essential status of flowing, therefore, is not per impossible, that of a moment in the extension of experience inseparable from the passage to an exact limit, and therefore mathematical limit. Rather, flowing is an instance of the ideally identical descriptive essence of any arbitrarily given subjective experience, in which the appearance of the unity of the objective identity of things and the world appears. As the instance of an essence, flowing therefore does not refer to anything individual, according to Husserl. That is, to something whose unity is empirically determined and therefore contingent, because as contingent, it can always appear otherwise. The constitution of internal time consciousness. The flowing manifold of the stream of subjective experience exhibits a phenomenological unity, which according to Husserl is constituted in internal time consciousness. The meaning of internal here is initially developed by Husserl in contradistinction to the time of the clock, the so-called external or objective time. However, the subjectivity of Husserl's account of time consciousness and the temporality constituted therein is in no way opposed to the time of the object. Rather, it is tasked with presenting the constitution of the unity of the object's presentation as objectively present in subjective experience from within the temporality of that experience's flowing manifold. This is the case because subsequent to the epoche, the ontological opposition between the perception of inner and outer objects is transformed into the transcendental distinction between the constitution of immanent and transcendent meanings. The constitution of the unity of the latter meanings, therefore, cannot be counted for in an opposition between the manifold of the stream of consciousness and the unity of an object external to it. But rather, that unity must be sought precisely in the phenomenon of the flowing manifold itself. This is to say, the phenomenological unity of the immanent and transcendent meanings must be sought within the manifold that composes the stream of consciousness. So it's crucial to follow what Husserl is talking about, I think, to understand that the phenomenological reflection that he's talking about is not an inner perception. That is, it's not the apprehension of an object whose ontological status is interior to the mind, in contradistinction to the external perception of something outside of the mind. That very inner-outer distinction dissolves with the phenomenological epoche, with the suspension of the ontological reality of all objects, including inner and outer objects. So what you have then is a transcendental reflection which provides a perspective for articulating the very phenomenal marks which characterize this distinction between inner and outer. And as phenomenological, that distinction can't be accounted for on the basis of appeals to objects outside the stream of consciousness. Certainly.
Are these collections extensional?
Are collections extensional?
Are they extensional? Like, if the collections have the same elements, are they the same?
For Husserl? Husserl would maintain that the distinctions he's making at this point when talking about the stream of consciousness is more fundamental than the logical distinction between intentional and extensional.
So it doesn't make sense. The question doesn't make sense.
Well, the question makes sense, but it doesn't speak to the issue that Husserl thinks he's speaking to when he talks about a phenomenological manifold.
So for him, this is basically like integration in a point that's flowing through time. So it like what's perceiving the stream of consciousness doesn't need to have an extension, right? Because like for me, for example, the extension is super important, like in these domains that are somehow separated from other similar domains, but in this sense, I would read it in a way that they don't require extension.
Yeah, it's a tricky business because you're dealing with the manifold. You're starting out basically with a lived experience, which has an intentional structure. It's directed towards an objective unity. And then you're reflecting on now the motive givenness of that experience. And the motive givenness of that experience for Husserl is temporal. And as we'll see, the temporality has an intentional structure, consciousness of, and then the temporality of which the consciousness is conscious of. And I'll get to all that in detail. But the tricky part is the act of reflection itself that is involved in phenomenological cognition itself is the product of the stream of consciousness. And so we'll see that this presents challenges to Husserl's account, which I'll try to detail here. Okay, so Husserl's phenomenological account of the temporal unity of the manifold of consciousness tracked the development of his phenomenology from static to genetic. On the one hand, the static account employed the perceptual presentation of the transcendent object and the unity of its meaning as the guiding clue to account for the constitution of the temporal unity of the manifold of consciousness. On the other hand, the genetic account sought to account for the constitution of the immanent unity of the temporal manifold of consciousness itself on the basis of syntheses of consciousness that are both passively given and pre-objective. Both accounts apply the same correlations between the three phases of time consciousness, retention, primal impression, and protension, to the temporality of objective presentation, that is past, present, future. In the static account, this correlation is presented by Husserl as the essence of the temporal unity of the finite stream of consciousness that come and go. So finite streams. In the genetic account, the correlation is presented as the essence of the absolute, pre-objective and unobjectifiable, standing, streaming origin of the living present, wherein appear and disappear the manifold finite streams of consciousness. Okay, Husserl's static and genetic accounts of the constitution of the temporal unity of the ego. The methodological commitment of transcendental phenomenology to account for the unity of the phenomenological manifold without appeal to objects or objective meanings that do not have their source in the transcendental immanence of that manifold, as has been remarked often enough, is broken by Husserl's Cartesian self-interpretation of the phenomenological manifold subjectivity. For my purpose, only the implications of this for his account of the unity of the phenomenological manifold will be taken up. These implications concern Husserl's account of the static and genetic constitution of the unity of the transcendental ego as an object immanent to the phenomenological manifold. In the case of Husserl's static account of the ego's unity, that unity is accounted for as a pole that underlies the manifold flowing perspectives of the stream of consciousness, which are intentionally directed to the unity of meaning of the transcendent object. As such, the ego's unity as a pole is constituted in opposition to the objectivity of the meaning of the transcendent object, which is itself characterized by Husserl as a pole whose unity underlies, in the technical sense of transcending, the manifold perspectives in which it appears to consciousness. Husserl's static account of the constitution of the ego's unity is therefore dependent on its being posited in opposition to the unity of the object's meaning as transcendent. One consequence of this is that the constitutive account of its unity as an object immanent to the phenomenological manifold is derivative. It is derivative in the precise sense that the account of the unity as a pole presupposes that of the objective pole to which it's opposed in Husserl's descriptive account of its unity. Husserl's genetic account of the ego's unity recognizes that because the ego's static unity as a pole belongs to the stream of consciousness, its unity as an enduring identity and the temporality of the flowing of that stream is something whose constitution must be accounted for in terms of its genesis in that temporality. The static account of the ego's unity is limited in that regard, as its status as a pole underlying the temporal flowing of the manifold of consciousness places its unity as somehow being constituted outside of that flow. Husserl attempts to get around the temporal limits of this static account by providing account of the temporality of the ego's mode of givenness as a unity. That account attends specifically to the ego's mode of appearance as an object immanent to the flow of consciousness, wherein its identity as the subject of that flow presents itself as a unity, not only in that flow's present moment, but also in the moments of that flow that are no longer present and therefore past. As such, the unity of the ego's identity must encompass two temporal dimensions, those of the present and the past. The genesis of its unity therefore requires an account of how the two different temporal moments that compose its identity are unified. Husserl's account of the how in question appeals to the act of reflection, in which the ego is given as a reflected phenomenon that manifests itself in terms of the radically different dimensions of time that characterize the how of its phenomenal manifestation. The reflective act in question is charged by Husserl with the task of synthesizing the ego's givenness as a unity, having been present and therefore no longer present but past, with its givenness as enduring in the present. Such a synthesis is supposed to take place on the basis of the recognition that both the present and past temporal dimensions of the ego are essential components of its identity as ego, such that its unity is the same ego is constituted. The ego's unity is therefore constituted as a unity in temporal difference, or equivalently as a difference in temporal unity. Husserl's term for the peculiar temporality of this unity is the living present. Problems with Husserl's genetic account of the ego's temporal identity. There are two interrelated and fundamental problems with this genetic account of the ego's temporal identity. The first concerns the phenomenological status of its unity. The second concerns that of the phenomenological origin of the manifold its unity putatively unifies. Regarding the account of the constitution of the ego's unity as an identity that encompasses its past and present temporality, it is evident that Husserl's account of the form of this unity does not originate in the manifold that composes that temporality, but rather it is imposed on it from without by an act of reflection that does not belong to that manifold. The resulting unity of the ego as the putative living present, wherein the past and present phases of the ego are supposed to be united in the genesis of the ego's identity, despite the difference between these temporal phases, therefore has its basis in the unity of another temporal manifold, namely the act that generates the reflection on these phases. The genesis of the unity of the second manifold cannot be accounted for by the unity of the ego's identity, since it is supposed to be responsible for that identity. It is therefore apparent that this account of the genesis of the identity of the ego, is that which encompasses the living present, does not have its basis in a unity generated from a phenomenological manifold. Instead, it has its basis in a form-content schema that is, in effect, a reconstruction of that which it is supposed to provide a phenomenological account of. Namely, the ego's unity is an identity constitutively generated by the phenomenological manifold to which it belongs. The form in question is the living present that is supposed to be synthetically generated from the reflective act of recognition that the temporally discrete past and present phases of the ego's temporality belong to the same ego. The content in question is the temporally determinate manifold composed of the discrete temporal phases whose unity as temporal, the form of the living present, is supposed to unify. Regarding this content, that is, the manifold phases of temporality that the reflective act is supposed to synthesize into the unity of the living present, a closer look at Husserl's account of its genesis will disclose that this account, too, has its basis in the form-content schema. As such, this account reconstructs rather than evidently discloses the descriptive essence of the flowing stream of consciousness that composes a phenomenological manifold. Moreover, Husserl's account of this content itself, on closer inspection, will be disclosed as having its basis in the conceptuality of exact mathematical essences. As mentioned, Husserl's account of the subjective phenomenon of time articulates it in terms of the essential correlation between the phases of time consciousness and those of temporality. Hence, essentially correlated to the temporal phase of the past is the consciousness of the past consciousness, retention, which to the temporal phase, while to the temporal phase of the future is correlated the consciousness of the future, protension. And to the temporal phase of the present is correlated the consciousness of the originary now, primal impression. These three phases of time and the consciousness of them are meant both to capture the essence of three of the four phenomenal dimensions of the unitary phenomena of time, and to prepare the way for capturing the essence of time's fourth dimension, that of its succession. Husserl's account of succession employs the descriptive terms flowing or streaming to characterize the morphologically eidetic singular movement of time consciousness. Husserl traces this movement in terms of an account of the relation of retentions and protensions to the originary now. Retentional consciousness is described as the awareness of the past that at once is a succession of just past elapsed nows and an enduring awareness of the passing of the elapsed nows that takes place in the primal impression of the originary now. Potential consciousness is described as the awareness of the future that is at once the arrival into the originary now of a succession of anticipated nows and the enduring awareness of their anticipation in the original now's primal impression. Okay, so the next section is 3 salient aspects of Husserl's account of the essence of temporal succession. 3 things stand out in this account of the essence of the successive movement characteristic of the phenomenon of time. 1, although it characterizes the essence of a succession, the essence in itself is not successive. That is, both the elapsing and arriving nows are characterized in terms of their relation to the original now's impressional awareness, which, unlike the nows that elapse and arrive, is characterized as unmoving. It is so characterized since, as the reference point for elapsing and arriving units of meaning, it itself does not move. 2, despite its non-motion, the primal impression is nevertheless the origin of the movement of time, by virtue of its status of the source of the multitude of nows that compose the temporal manifold of consciousness. This is the case because Husserl's descriptive account of that manifold maintains that each just past elapsing now retains a relation to the impressional now, which, among other things, can only be possible if each elapsing now is replenished by a fresh now that is fully present just insofar as it hasn't elapsed yet. And 3, nowhere so far in this account of the content of the manifold of the phases of temporality and consciousness of these phases as the eidetic singularity of the peculiar differentia of the units of meaning that compose these temporal and conscious phases been accounted for. Insofar as the differentia in question here concerns the constitution of each of the phases and the consciousness of them as an instance of something that is multiple, this is to say that Husserl's account of the temporal manifold of consciousness discussed so far does not address the phenomenological conditions of possibility of its givenness precisely as a phenomenological manifold. The next section, Husserl's account of the constitution of time consciousness does not reflect his late criticism of the immediacy of the givenness of impressions. Husserl's early investigation of inner time consciousness account for the differentia in question on the basis of a characterization of the material, sattvic content of the primal impression, namely its phenomenal status as a sensation. In contrast with the characterization of sensation in empirical theories of perception, namely as ununified bundles, Husserl initially maintained that the phenomenon of sensation appears as a datum. As such, its, quote, apprehension makes us conscious of something objective as given in person, which is then said to be objectively perceived, end quote. Sensory or eidetic data composed half of Husserl's initial account of the most fundamental and primitive distinction in the composition of a phenomenological manifold, the other half being intentional form. While Husserl's mature investigations in the crisis reject the fundamentality of this hylomorphic schema, and with that of eidetic data as being, quote, immediately given, end quote, Husserl nevertheless did not abandon the crucial role of the primal impression in his late manuscript's account of time. Indeed, the primal impression remained absolutely essential in Husserl's account of the source of the most basic units of the meanings proper to the temporality of the phenomenological manifold. Specifically, it is essential to his account of the original now given in it as something punctual, namely as a now point. Husserl's account of the now as a point as an ideal limit, as something abstract, as a form, gives rise to two crucial questions. On the one hand, in what sense, if any, are these terms descriptive in the precise sense of the criteria presented in Ideas 1 for distinguishing essences that are phenomenological from those that are mathematical? On the other hand, what methodological perspective is responsible for discerning this, as well as the other characteristics of the flowing manifold of time consciousness? Mindful of Husserl's criteria for distinguishing mathematical, which is to say exact essences from phenomenological, that is, morphological essences, the first question can be reformulated as follows. Is it possible to understand the terms in question, point, ideal limit, abstract, form, morphologically? On the surface, the obvious answer would seem to be no. Point and ideal limit signify something exact. And while form abstract need not signify something exact, nevertheless, if the form and abstraction in question referred to a point and an ideal limit, both would appear to mean something that is exact. But these terms are meant to describe not this or that individual phenomenological manifold, but the essence of any arbitrarily given manifold, and therefore to describe the essence in the sense of an eidetic singular. So the question may be refined, such that what is under interrogation is whether the phenomenologically peculiar ideal status of the essence itself, that is characteristic of the flowing dimension of the phenomenological manifold, is appropriately characterized in reference to the phenomenon of flowing by terms that have exact conceptual meanings, even though that which instantiates this essence is something that is inexact. Point and ideal limit then would characterize that which makes possible the appearance of something like a flowing that, in its concreteness, is neither punctual nor limited in the exact sense. The answer to this refined version of the question is no doubt connected with the answer to the question regarding the methodological perspective from which the basic units of the temporal phases of time are differentiated and time consciousness relationship to them discerned. In general, of course, the perspective in question is governed by the methodological protocol of the epoche. More particularly, the reflection in question is directed to the mode of givenness of the phenomenon of time, which is to say its appearance. As mentioned already, Husserl's account of its appearance tracks the static and genetic phases of the development of his thought. And for both, the crucial aspect characteristic of the appearance in question is the primal impression. Husserl's methodological access to the phenomena of time clearly presupposes the attempt to grasp the primal impression, whether in terms of its static correlation with the appearance of the object or its pre-objective and passive genesis.
There's plenty of time.
Excuse me?
There is plenty of time.
Okay. Husserl's methodological access to the phenomenon of time clearly, there's no harm in repetition, as Socrates and Hume said. So Husserl's methodological access to the phenomenon of time clearly presupposes the attempt to grasp the primal impression, whether in terms of its static correlation with the appearance of the object or its pre-objective and passive genesis. Crucial to either methodological approach is the resolution into a unity of that component of the primal impression that is designated as flowing, together with an account of the origin of the movement associated with that flowing. So next, I'm going to talk about an ambiguity in Husserl's account of the origin of the now. Leaving aside for the moment the implication of Husserl's own late recognition that impressions are not immediately given for his account of the origin of the movement in question, his account of the relation of the primal impression to the now can be seen to be problematic on its own terms. On the one hand, new impressions or sensations are characterized by him as already informed by the now, in which case the now is not presented as the content of the impression, but as its form. I'm quoting Husserl here from Lectures on Time Consciousness. The primordial temporal form of sensation, or as I can also put it, the temporal form of primordial sensation, here of the sensation belonging to the current now point, and only to this, must in strictness be defined through primordial sensation, so that the proposition asserted has to be taken not only as an indication of what it is supposed to mean, so that the proposition has to be taken only as an indication of what is supposed to be meant. On the other hand, the primal impression is characterized by Husserl as the phase of time consciousness that, quote, has as its content that which the word now signifies. Each now is the content of a new primal impression. What is problematical here is not so much, quoting Rudolf Burnett, the circular definition, end quote, or better, fallacy of equivocation evident in the account of the relation between the primal impression and the now, but the methodological presuppositions responsible for the ambiguity behind it. That is, the logical problem implicit in the characterization of the now is both the form of the primal impression, and thus as a structure inseparable from its appearance, as well as its content, and thus something that appears to, and therefore is, other than the primal impression's appearance, is derivative. As such, it has its source in the methodological attempt to grasp the eidetic singular of temporal flowing according to a form-content schema. Once this schema is projected onto the phenomenological manifold composed by time consciousness, the inexact essence of its flowing is divided exactly in two. A symptom, if not a sign of this, is Husserl's characterization of the now as belonging both to the form of the impression and to its content. The methodological inappropriateness of Husserl's employment of exact terms to characterize the inexact essence of the phenomenon of flowing, determinant of time consciousness, is compounded by his use of the concept of a continuum to characterize the essence of the temporal flow proper. The units of the continuum are characterized as a manifold of nows, each one of which has a temporal position relative to the primordial now in which it originates, into which its temporal position remains lated as it shifts with each fresh now. The continuum is composed of two dimensions, the past and future, from which the single dimensional flowing of time consciousness is constituted. The key to Husserl's account of the manifold of nows as continua, of past nows and nows to come, future, is what he calls the law of modification that governs the generation of their temporal position. The now point as an ideal limit manifests the form of the ever new nows generated by the primordial impression. The law of modification governs the movement of these nows in the temporal dimensions of the past and the future. The former dimension is constituted by the modification of the primordial impression called retention, and the latter by the modification of it called protension. In retention, the primordial impressions now is initially divided into the originary now and the just past now, which as just past remains a part of the primordial impression. Husserl terms this initial retention primary memory. Retention is also responsible for the modification of the just past now into the just past now, and again, the just past now, and so on, such that a continuum of retended nows is composed that recedes from the originary nows associated with the primordial impression. The law of modification also governs each retention of all the just past nows, and so on, such that a continuum of retended nows is composed that recedes from the originary nows associated with the primordial impression. The law of modification also governs each retention of retended nows, and so on, such that a continuum of retended nows is composed that recedes from the originary nows associated with the primordial impression. divided from the impressional now preceding, as it were, its division from the now point connected with the primordial impression. Thus, on Husserl's account, the law of modification governs the generation of the phenomenon of the past as a series of just past nows, each one of which is itself retentionally each one of which is itself a retentionally generated continuum containing retentions of all the just past nows up to that primordial now from which it was originally divided. The continuum of retented nows forms the retentional horizon of the original now, or of the originary nows, wherein is constituted primordial memory. Husserl contrasts the unmediated relation of primary memory to its origin and primary impression with the mediated relation to the originary nows of secondary memory, which he designates as recollection. On Husserl's account, the retentional horizon exhibits the capacity to be awakened, such that that which was originally presented in the primordial impression is recalled as an identity that transcends the unmediated flow of primary impressions ceaselessly slipping away in the continuum of retentions. The making present, the Gegenwärtigen of the identity in question, constitutes the transcendence of the thing in the living present as something that is identical, and therefore is something that stands in objective contrast to the subjective manifold of the unmediated pre-objective passive flow of the continuum of impressions and retentions in which it originally presented itself. Three things stand out in Husserl's account of the essence of the phenomenological manifold of time consciousness. That is his description of the eidetic singular that articulates the phenomenological condition of possibility of this manifold's flowing movement. One, the ambiguity of the now, which is manifest in its characterization by Husserl as both the form and content of the primordial impression, makes it impossible to discern eidetically the origin of the phenomenological manifold in which time consciousness is constituted. This is the case above all because the origin of the form and content of this manifold is attributed to the same structural phenomenon, that is the now. Thus, in the case of both the finite and absolute manifolds at issue here, it is impossible to discern on the basis of Husserl's account whether the source of the multiplicity of nows that constitutes them is formal or material, sacred. Either way, the division of the unity of the present now into the continua of just past nows and nows to come, each one of which, just past or to come, according to the law of modification, presupposes, rather than accounts for the phenomenal basis of the cuts in question. That is, rather than appeal to the how of their appearance, the temporal shifts come about that constitute the flowing stream of just past nows and nows to come, the exact concept of continuum invoked by the law of modification is supposed to account for the phenomenological condition of possibility of these shifts. The priority of memory in the making present of the transcendent object brings to the fore the question of the relation of the phenomenon of forgetting to both memory and to the emergence of that which appears as present in the living present. So now I'm going to maintain Husserl's methodological presuppositions block, a phenomenological count of the unity and multiplicity of a phenomenological manifold. For our purposes, Husserl's use of an exact mathematical concept to characterize the eidetic singularity, putatively responsible for the flowing of the temporal manifold, will be the focus of the discussion of these points. The difficulty, if not the impossibility, of accounting for the phenomenon of forgetting once the concept of continuum is evoked in connection with the law of modification is evident in the answer to the following question. Does the law of modification in the case of retentional consciousness admit exceptions? If not, the original noun in which the continuum of any finite manifold is generated should always be capable of being remembered. Husserl, in fact, admits as much. Ideally, quoting Husserl, ideally a consciousness is probably even possible in which everything remains preserved retentionally. This account of memory is thus challenged to account for the fundamental discontinuity of the phenomena of both the past and that which is forgotten from present consciousness. Moreover, one searches in vain in Husserl's manuscripts on time consciousness for an account of forgetting. Likewise, in the case of the potential scope of the law of modification, there is the related difficulty of accounting for the phenomenon of the emergence of something to come that is unanticipated and therefore discontinuous with what is expected. Given Husserl's account of the symmetry between protensional and retensional modifications, as well as the role of the latter in the structure of the former, the answer to the following question is crucial. Whether exceptions to the lawful foundational role of retentions and the constitutions of protensions are possible. Or in other words, can the lawful modification that generates protension account for the phenomenological emergence of something that is completely unanticipated? Given the tight connection in Husserl's account between retention and protension, wherein the continuum of retentions adumbrates the horizon of the continuum of protensions, the answer to this question would seem to be no. Husserl's appeal to exact mathematical concepts to characterize the eidetic singular of the flowing unity of the manifold of time consciousness has been shown to be inadequate for the task of accounting for the essential inexactness of both the unity and multiplicity of the phenomenon in question. The phenomena of unity and multiplicity, however, remain. And indeed, they remain in need of a phenomenological account of their essential conditions of possibility. At issue, then, is an account of the constitution of the unity and multiplicity of the phenomenological manifold uncovered by Husserl's transcendental philosophy, which, as we have seen, involves the appearance of two manifolds, that of the living present and that of the finite stream of lived experience that come and go in the living presence. Accounts of both are therefore tasks for the future, the horizon of which will be sketched in the remainder of my discussion. Husserl's last work, Crisis, introduced historical meditations on both the essence of the meaning operative in the exact sciences and the most immediate experience of the world. In both cases, manifolds are involved, and therefore the constitution of both the unity and multiplicity out of which they are composed. Because of the fragmentary nature of these meditations, however, they only offer hints about how to advance the problematic. In order to advance beyond these hints, the historical horizon of the meaning, inseparable from the unity and multiplicity of manifolds, adumbrated in Husserl's last work, will be delineated. There are three manifolds in play here. That composing the living present, that composing the finite stream of lived experience that come and go in the living present, and that composing the domain of mathematics. As we have seen above, Husserl's account of both the unity and multiplicity composing each of these manifolds cannot withstand phenomenological self-critique. In the first two manifolds mentioned here, that is because both the unity and multiplicity of each are accounted for on the basis of illegitimate appeals to mathematical as exact concepts. The last mentioned manifold, it is because the unity and multiplicity are accounted for on the basis of a logical unity that is not phenomenologically established, and moreover rejected by the development of the science of logic in the first half of the 20th century. In the German version of the text, The question of the origin of geometry is an intentional historical problem, published by Eugen Fink. A connection between sedimentation and forgetting is made. Quote, sedimentation is always somehow forgetfulness. End quote. This connection provides a crucial hint for future research in phenomenological manifolds, as it points in the direction of the phenomenological fundamentality of forgetfulness over memory in the constitution of the past. In connecting the passive diminishment of the original meaning of words and concepts constitutive of the phenomenon of sedimentation with the phenomenon of forgetfulness, Husserl seems to recognize the phenomenological priority of discontinuity in the constitution of the horizon of the past in relation to the constitution of the present. Sedimentation is inseparable from the traditional transmission of knowledge, according to Husserl. The phenomenon of tradition, on Husserl's view, manifests the intentional historical dimension of the past that constitutes an essential horizon of the living present. In Husserl's fragmentary analysis of the crises, the multiplicity of present-day philosophies is symptomatic of the lack of unity crucial to the essence of philosophy. It's precisely this lack of unity that motivates Husserl's historical reflection back to the original intentional historical processes constitutive of the foundational meanings of the exact natural and philosophical sciences. Husserl's term for the goal of this reflection, reactivation, however, indicates that he is still under the spell of his account of the primacy of memory in the constitution of the past that is evident in his account of internal time consciousness. Hence, a first task for future phenomenological research is the investigation of the role of the phenomenon of forgetfulness, the constitution of both internal and historical time consciousness. Related to this first task is the second of reassessing Husserl's account of recollection, and the making present of the transcendent object in the living present. This is the case because once the discontinuity between the horizon of the past in relation to the present is recognized, the phenomenological account of the horizon of the past being directly accessible to acts of recollection, such that the latter exhibit the unmediated capacity to awaken primary memories, becomes problematic. It does so because recognition of the essential discontinuity between the phenomena of the present and past presents evidence that challenges any phenomenological account that presupposes, without further ado, the direct access of present acts to the past appearances to consciousness of both objects and their mode of presentation. In connection with this evidence, the investigation of the phenomenological appropriateness of the descriptor recollection for a phenomenon, namely recollection, in which there is no forgetfulness in play, is another task for future phenomenological research. The third phenomenological task involves the investigation of the constitution of both the multiplicity and unity of the immediately given manifolds that begin and end. Absence the immediacy of impressions in their givenness, and absent too priority of memory in the constitution of their flow, the investigation of the role of the phenomenon of sedimentation, forgetfulness, and recollection in their constitution of the living present is called for. A fourth and final phenomenological task involves the investigation of the constitution of the logic proper to the symbolic mathematics that determines, according to Husserl here in the crisis, what in fact, and in a way practically understandable in mathematical work, coherent mathematical field is. This task is called for because Husserl still holds that the answer to the questions to be found in his notion of theory of manifolds. Theory of manifolds is the universal science of the definite manifolds. That is, Husserl's answer to this question in his last work is the same as it was in his first phenomenological work. Inseparable from this task is an account of the intentional historical meaning that is sedimented in the origins and development of the universal formalization that is the sine qua non for contemporary mathematics and therefore of fundamental importance for the intelligibility of its meaning. Such an account would have to be attentive to the distinction between idealized and formalized mathematical meanings mentioned above. In connection with this investigation, the possibility of complete reactivation of these origins, in light of the role of forgetfulness in the constitution of the phenomenon of sedimentation, will also have to be critically explored. Thank you.
Thank you, Burt, for a rather deep overview. And are there questions?
Yeah, this was very nice. But I was confused by the fact what you said that there are two dimensions, and one dimension in this one of these constructs is past, and one is future, which to me, like, they don't need to be somehow shared amongst the manifolds that are constructing their ways through perception of time or whatever. But to me, this is kind of just part of one dimension, of the temporal dimension, right? Like, how does it work when you have it on a plane, the past and present? This was kind of confusing to me. So can you elaborate on it?
So are you questioning whether?
I wouldn't say that I'm questioning the use of term dimension. To me, this can be two vectors, or no, it's like the thing is that I tend to think in pictures and images. So for me, what you were essentially saying was that this is kind of like a trajectory through some hypothetical space or something, and this is the temporal thing of the manifold, like the subjective now, let's say. Another manifold is how these subjective nows are kind of like connected through these like immediately successing vector to the perception of time. And then the third manifold is that this is like one hypothetical agent, this is another hypothetical agent, you know, they somehow, they don't need to have like simple idea of simultaneity. But the third manifold is somehow, I don't know, like mediating the possibility of interactions and exchange of information between them, right? So this was kind of, to me, this was consistent and nice and something. But the thing is that when you said that there are like two dimensions in his philosophy, and one is dimension of past and one is dimension of future, to me, this was very unclear how this concept of whether this is like one dimension and this is like the second dimension, how does it fit to this image that I was kind of constructing in my head from what you were saying?
Okay.
But maybe I completely misunderstood it. But otherwise, you know, like these three elements that kind of constitute one coherent image, that was okay, but I wasn't sure what the past and future means in this context when it's two dimensions.
Okay. I think crucial in all this is that Husserl understands his analysis of time to be focusing on the phenomenon of time, the way in which time appears.
Yes.
And the way in which time appears is a tricky business, since methodologically you have this idea that prior to reflection on our experience is directed objectively, and there's no awareness of the way in which things are appearing. The experience is directed and terminates in the object. And Husserl calls this the natural attitude or straightforward consciousness. And so the very appearance of time for Husserl requires this reflection on the way in which experience is given. And initially, experience for Husserl is always given in relation to either objects in the world, or the horizon wherein all objects of the world appear.
Yeah.
For Husserl, there's three manifolds, but I don't know if they're the manifolds you're talking about. Husserl has this notion that there's lived experiences that come and go. Okay, so this lecture is one that will come and go. Our experience of lunch will come and go. But these experiences as temporal presuppose, when these finite experiences terminate, time doesn't stop. They presuppose a more foundational realm, what Husserl calls the absolute.
Okay, so he works with the notion of absolute time.
Well, he works with the notion of an absolute manifold, wherein the manifolds that begin and end appear. But these are just points of departure. The phenomenological question is to give an account of how these appear.
Yeah.
And if it's to be phenomenological according to his own criteria, or fundamental criterion, the descriptors of what's going on can't be exact.
Yes.
Okay.
I think.
But this is the problem.
This is
they're exact.
No. I think the problem is there is almost no problem, right? Like this is perfectly, I think, compatible with some of the temporary physics, right? Because like you can see analogies between this and between what's in physics. Like what's the primary memory? It's basically like the history of some domain of whatever. Like, but what we can call, I don't know, like domain of relationships that's relatively stable, because these like subdomains of the domain cannot assume relativistic speed to other of the subdomain. This is what constitutes somehow the relative unity of this subdomain. So it needs to move through time as one piece. I cannot just chop off my hand and toss it at a light speed somewhere else. This is why I am somehow this unity in this multitude. Yeah, this is like I'm like well integrated thing, and I come into relationships with other well integrated things, and each of us has like subjective time. So what is past and what is present from other similar domains, this can be very relative, but the mathematics of the whole thing ensures that when we know like our relative speed to each other, we can calculate how the third thing appears to each of us. Like I know what's my speed to I am A, I know my speed and direction towards B, and I know my speed and something to C. So I can calculate how B can see C, even if I can predict that the future of C is past for B or something like that. But still, that's the thing. Like even the temporary physics doesn't have a very good concept of time. But the thing is that we can somehow accept that the time is a quality of this domain, that time to some extent is subjective. That's what constitutes the history of this domain. So in there are like always like this is the point, which is, let's say, the present, but again, the point is somehow misleading term, but this is the present. And at the derivation of it, there is only one dimension, and in one direction is the relative future of this history, of this like consistent history, and on the other side there is past. But it's still one dimension. That's the thing. But
no, these are all
fine.
Good remarks. I just remind us that phenomenology, as Husserl envisioned it, is dealing with questions of origin of the way things appear.
Of perception.
And the problem in his account of time consciousness is this notion of primal impression.
Yeah.
Okay, so there was time involves some kind of movement. So what generates the movement? Well, for Husserl, it's the sensation, and this is pure empiricism. And he himself recognized that phenomenologically sensations don't appear.
Yes, okay.
Sensations only appear at a higher level reflection. They don't appear as first level objects. And that's the whole motor, the whole engine that drives the movement of time.
Okay.
Is this notion of the primal impression. And so there's two problems. One, he already recognized that it doesn't appear. So that's the other is in his account of it, he's using a form schema. Right, you have the primal impression that it is the content, and you have the now is the form. But his account equivocates because he attributes the now point to both the form and the matter.
You always need the three, right? Like you need the three organizational manifolds to constitute.
But once you get rid of that, once you realize that you can't generate the motion of the stream of consciousness from sensations, the problem. You still have a flow, but you have to provide another way of accounting.
I think there is like less problem with the appearance of sensations than with appearance of objects, because the object like everything is just perception, right? Like nobody has ever seen an object without perception. Yeah.
So maybe there is another question. Okay, I would like to ask, you were talking about ideal limit. Is it the same thing as a point, or is there some clarification on this notion in Husserl about the notion of limit? Because there are several possible ways how to define it or how to grasp it.
Yeah, when Husserl in the ideas makes the canonical distinction between an eidetic science that's mathematical and an eidetic science that's phenomenological, he takes as his the structure of an exact essence what he calls ideas in the Kantian sense, which aren't really in the Kantian sense, but they are ideas. The idea that the exact concept has its basis, and this really applies mostly to geometry, has its basis in experience that then anticipates something, anticipates the trend of what is appearing in experience as an exact limit. So you have the notion of passage to a limit. And when Husserl says the answer to the question of whether a phenomenological manifold is mathematical, he's thinking in this sense: does it have the structure of an idea, phenomenologically clarified idea in the Kantian sense, which involves a passage to a limit, or the anticipation of a limit? And his answer is no, because the structure of the temporal structure of lived experience involves a movement that can't be captured by exact concepts.
So is there a reflection about on the foundation of the calculus that was quite recent at that time? Because I think it's one of the main points to grasp the movement, the motion through by the means of point of static concepts. I didn't understand completely the composition of the continuum in Husserl from your talk. So is there a way how to explain it simply? because there is always correlation between motion and between.
What we're talking about is now the appearance of a continuum. Husserl uses that term to say that you get the flowing of time appears as a continuum because of what he calls this law of modification. Okay, so this is an attempt to account for the generation of the movement. So you have these impressions, and they're fresh. They keep coming from who knows where. But you keep having these impressions, primal impressions that have punctuality of the now. Now, yeah.
But there is no punctuality of now. It was shown already in Aristotle that it is a nonsense. How is it possible to speak about the multiplicity of elapsed nows? It's complete nonsense.
Perhaps.
The Husserl still means that continuum is made out of points? No. It looks like.
Well, the notion of impression, the notion of retention, the notion of protension, these are terms that are referring to the subjective how, past as a unit of meaning, present as a unit of meaning, future as a unit of meaning, appears. I mean, this is Husserl's claim.
It's a process. Like
this descriptive account claims that we have I mean, this is it shows in how many ways Husserl is still a 19th century thinker. I mean, this is empiricism. This is the idea you have somehow the primordial original givenness of sensation, right, which isn't static. There's a movement, and then Husserl then is tacking onto that the form content schema. Okay, so the form of the impression is the now.
There is no now.
Yeah, there was a now there is no now, but
before there was now. No, but I think like.
But the other thing is, we're talking about the appearance.
Yeah.
And not only that, we're talking about the phenomenological cognition of that appearance, which involves a reflection. Yeah, so objectively, there's no now.
Yeah. And we can change this with language. We will just stop talking about points and we will talk about these vectors of now. That's what I was talking about. That it's never just like collapsed into a point. It's always like, you know, the direction from immediate, like just before, what was it? And that gets from just before, and it directs to just after. And that's this vector in which, like at the intersection, it's the thing of our perception that's also very much determined by our language, that we somehow categorize this as the stream of individual impressions of individual nows. It's just like, yes. So.
But we have diverged from the question asked by Husserl about the composition of the continuum.
okay, but he's interested in the continuum in mathematics, so in Leibniz, etc. While this is about how it appears to you. So these are finite number of discrete points, and this form continuum.
Why invoke it if it's something? It must be like somehow this what this says, because he invoked the notion in his exposition. So the question was about how the notion of continuum was used in Husserl's exposition, wasn't it?
Yeah, but it's not the mathematical concept.
It's invoked descriptively. Okay, so this is the whole. So he's making distinction between exact and descriptive.
Intuitive understanding, without further analysis, without going into its instruction.
The claim is this: if you reflect on your experience of anything, how does that experience present itself? How does it show up? And you should start with, okay, it was our experience of objects. Okay, so I see these objects, they're all these stable things, but if and this is a phenomenological claim. If I reflect, and again, this isn't the reflection here is not an inner perception. I'm not looking into my mind and trying to find something. The reflection here is already presupposing that these objects that are seemingly transcendent to my perception, that existential thesis has been bracketed, because I'm only concerned with how things appear. And the way these objects that show up in my experience that have transcended, meaning the way they appear is perspectively. They cannot but appear in a continuum, or I have to forget the continuum, a manifold of perspectives. And then the question is, well, what is the motive given this? How are these perspectives given? And they're given temporally. And then the question is, well, how does that time appear? And Husserl's claim is that the focus of the appearance of time is the now. And of course, this can be challenged. Heidegger challenged it. Heidegger said that the most fundamental phase of time is the future, not the now.
Okay, so is there a possible connection between the notions of point and horizon? Because it's one of the ways we can understand the problem of continuum, dynamic change, and of becoming.
That might mean another way to approach this, which is the way, not the way I do, because again, I'm taking Husserl at his word that phenomenology is a descriptive science, not an exact science. But another way, and Bart Van Atten pointed this out, another way of interpreting it is this, and there are some scattered remarks of Husserl, where you can use these exact concepts to model what's going on in the phenomenological. Thanks, Stepan. But I don't, and I think that would be how to pursue your question.
No, but if you look at on a movie, there are 60 discrete pictures, nothing more. There's nothing continuous, but you have a perception of continuity. So the perception of continuity can have nothing to do with real motion. So it's totally different. It's just the 60 pictures, and Husserl is describing how out of 60 pictures you get an idea of continuity, and mathematics describes how of infinity many points you get a smooth motion. And that's, I think, has nothing to do with each other. The philosophy of movie, and that's the philosophy of physics.
There's still the motion which makes the continuity.
Yeah, but which motion? It means the motion that appears on the screen.
The motion of the pictures.
How much was he really inspired by the idea of movie?
Husserl went to, I think, the movies once.
Yes.
He was so shaken by it.
Okay, that's what I thought.
Yeah.
Yeah, because to me, this is not the philosophy of a movie. This is kind of like going like beyond the naive impression that this is how you constitute some continuum. This is, I think this idea that, okay, like there is some frequency of what eye is able to perceive. So when you put enough images in a row, even if they are discrete and discontinuous, you will construct the continuum out of them. I think this is an attempt to do something else, to go beyond this, right?
How can you go beyond this phenomenon?
No, very easily, because the phenomenon is not about that there are discrete images. It's that it doesn't matter to some extent how you construct these images out of the subsequentiality of the possibility of perception.
Okay, but still, that means if the Husserlian picture has to work in the movie model,
yes,
And it works so it cannot be about the physical stuff. And he's bracketing physics away.
I know, because he's interested in perception as perception. This is like empirical.
That's why I thought that
yes,
you cannot find there anything reasonable for your work. That's what my guess.
no, but these things.
There must be a good explanation why he employed this notion. I think he was perfectly aware of the composition of the continuum as it was modified as science.
Because
it has done mathematical education, so I don't think we use this term lightly. So.
He gave it up, no? This means astrological and again. No, so he went into the first arithmetic and then he realized that he wants to do something different, so he left it.
Yeah, well, he discovered the problem, right? There's no logic that can account for how it is that symbolic cognition or mathematics works.
Yeah.
And so he and of course too, he was haunted by the whole problem of psychologism.
Yeah.
Because all of this presupposes, right, a reflection on lived experience. It presupposes something subjective. So how can, in the flowing of subjective experience, objective meanings appear? Well, no, I'm saying, but this is a problem that tortured Husserl. Okay. Because if you account for it on the basis of the appeal to the experience, you say that the experience is what generates it. You're in danger of psychologism. You're in danger of reducing the objective meaning of that is appearing to a movement that doesn't have exact limits or unity. So he had to, just to finish the thought. So Ladislav's thought actually. So yeah, he started out with all these problems, but then he said, well, the way to do this is with his phenomenology, a new science that will investigate the structures of experience and show precisely how these structures of experience, not causally, but as things appear, all these objective meanings appear.
So I think he was in a very good direction into create a nice new science of this manifold of bilateral relationships, but he somehow still wanted to preserve the idea of objectivity, which is the problem, right? Because if he would be okay with the primarily of this like subjectivity of like only how to construct the world of consensus from subjective perspectives, that would be fine. Like to replace the objective layer with this idea of consensus that might be incomplete, partial, whatever. That's how consensus is. But he somehow wanted to like reconstruct and rehabilitate the objectivity. So that was the only point where he felt that he failed, right?
No, he failed because Husserl on his deathbed laments that he failed in his mission to deliver to his students a scientific philosophy. And then he adds the aside, but I never really studied philosophy. I only studied mathematics and science. So he took seriously, and a lot of people took seriously, especially the mathematicians, especially Burt, the idea that this new science phenomenology, it's transcendental. So when we're talking about subjectivity here, there's a whole key distinction that has to be made, at least within the Husserl's argument, between empirical subjectivity and transcendental subjectivity. And so the burden of the founder of a new science took precedence to continuing to take this science and then to go back to the original problems that motivated him to found this new science.
But I think,
but he saw it as a research project.
Yes,
that's why the fact that Husserl didn't say something, or the fact that there's all these problems in his account, that doesn't mean you dismiss it, because you still have the ideal of a return to the things themselves, an account of the appearance of meanings that doesn't presuppose causality and doesn't presuppose meanings that have no evidential basis.
Yeah. But I think he's succeeded in a way that like all these people like Vopenka and I don't know, Neubauer and all these people here, for example, they have read this and they were very much inspired by it. So when we are reading, I don't know, something like, I don't know in English, but the Negotiation of Common World by Neubauer, for example, I think this is full of an inspiration from this. But he has no problem in replacing the idea of objectivity with the idea of negotiated consensus. And this is, and I think like this is the element that kind of like switches this into like completely non-problematic description of something that is relevant to the science of how perception and perspective appear and interact, or something like this. So this,
yeah, so negotiated consensus, I mean, again, Husserl would say, okay, we have such a thing. How does it appear? How does it show up as a phenomenon? And then he would talk about inner subjectivity, structure of inner subjectivity.
So it's solved.
So let's have an experience of lunch. Thank you again. Thank you for the discussion.